Good morning to everybody. I am happy to see that our conference room is almost full. Our final topic, or our final session of today, it's about the lessons learned. And I think that after yesterday's nice and lovely dinner we had and we enjoyed, we should really think about us. Have we been able to learn? Have we been able to learn about the cyber conflicts? We have asked to join with us today three distinguished panelists. Mr. Jason Healy, and you can find his articles also in the conference proceedings, Dr. Brandon Valeriano, and Mr. Keir Giles. And we have asked Mr. Edward Lucas to come and to act as a moderator of the session. Just a few words about Edward. He has got a very long and rich bio. You can find it on our website. But I just wanted to pick up words which start with E or C. Editor, economist, energy, cybersecurity, espionage, Eastern Europe, Center for European Policy Analysis, Edward Snowden, cyberphobia, and so on and so on. But one thing is missing. Actually, Mr. Edward Lucas has an e-residency card. He is the owner of the world's first e-residency card. And with these words, I'd like to pass the floor over to Edward.
Thanks very much indeed, Larry, and it's a pleasure to be back here at CyCon and to be chairing this really interesting session. It's actually, even the title is in a way quite contentious, because some people would argue we haven't really had any cyber conflicts yet, and the idea that we are already in an era of interstate cyber conflict is an interesting and debatable one. But we couldn't have a better panel here to discuss these issues. And I'm not going to give long introductions. We're going to kick off with Jason Healy. Jay has written a book called A Fierce Domain, which is a history of cyber conflicts starting from 1986, which shows you how deep the roots are on this. He's been to 5 CyCons, which is pretty good. And his main point he's going to look at is that we should examine the aims of the adversaries and whether they've succeeded in those aims when we're trying to draw lessons from cyber conflicts. I'm also very pleased to have Brandon Valeriano here. He's written an excellent book on Russia called Russian Coercive Diplomacy. Unfortunately, it costs $90. The nice thing about working at The Economist is I get these books free because they hope we're going to review them, so I have a copy. I recommend if you can find someone else to pay for your copy, try and get one. If you can't do that, read the article in Foreign Affairs which summarizes it, which is not free, I think, or it's the one free article you get a month, so you can get it that way. Welcome, Brandon. This is his first CyCon. And then on my left, your right, is Keir Giles, who I've known for a very long time. And there's two things I want to say about Keir. First is that he's been to more CyCons than President Ilves, because he's been to every one of them, and President Ilves missed one because he was ill one year. So Keir's a real veteran, not only of this subject, but also of this conference. But something that most of you probably don't know is that after Keir left the Royal Air Force, his first proper job was breaking the Russian fuel blockade of what was then Ukrainian Crimea, or helping to do that. He insisted he wasn't in charge of it, but he was contributing to getting fuel to the Ukrainian bases in Crimea. So you have excellent credentials, Keir, and welcome back. I'm going to try and keep our speakers to time, because just as the internet is a peer-to-peer network and Estonia is a peer-to-peer country, this conference should be peer-to-peer as well, and we want to get time for you to put your questions to the panel and make your contributions too. So I'm encouraging the speakers to stay to time. We're going to kick off with Jay Healy. Jay, over to you.
Great. Good morning, and welcome to the Hangover panel. Everyone is looking quite bright, and that's much appreciated. So I really love this panel, that it's lessons learned from cyber conflict. It's looking back at some of the cyber conflicts that we've had and trying to say, what does that teach us? What can we learn about the larger scale dynamics of the way mostly nations have been behaving in this space, and how will that help us think about the dynamics of the conflicts which might be to come? So I really like this because we're starting to shift into new spaces and new ways to ask these kinds of questions so that we can be better prepared for the conflicts that are coming next. I think this is very important for us that are in the space as researchers or practitioners. So my work on this paper has been in my sharing of saying, what can we learn about the dynamics of the conflicts that have been fought so far? And it started with the question of, what's victory in cyber conflict? Now, when I first started hearing this question at CyCon and other places 5-6 years ago, at first I didn't think there was an interesting question here, because it seemed like cyber conflicts would largely be fought alongside physical or kinetic conflicts, and so trying to judge the effects of the cyber conflict separately from the physical conflict, it didn't seem to have a whole lot of meaning to me. It didn't strike me as a very interesting sort of question. But really, over the past couple of years, especially in Washington, D.C., you'd hear this drumbeat of we're losing, from Chinese espionage, from look at Shamoon or the rest. You just heard this constant drumbeat of we're losing. And yet, after hearing about Stuxnet, when you're reading what Ralph Langner or David Sanger was teaching us about Stuxnet, after we learned from Edward Snowden, you still heard this drumbeat of we're losing. And it wasn't necessarily obvious to me, and I didn't think much of the world outside of the United States, that the United States was necessarily losing, that we were necessarily behind based on what we'd learned. So all of a sudden, it did strike me that we need a bit more rigorous treatment in the way that we're approaching these questions. And in my article in the proceedings was one way to try and get about it. So going through the literature review, it seemed there wasn't a lot that addressed this question specifically. As much as we did, it seemed to come down into these two different categories. One that was looking specifically at the tactical engagement. Did one side achieve their tactical effects? And so victory was if the attacker was achieving their tactical effects. The defender could claim a victory if they were able to fight off the hacker and make sure they weren't achieving those effects. So if you got hacked, you lost. If you got really, really badly hacked, you really lost. And you saw a lot of these quotes, especially coming out, for example, in Sony, Estonia, and the rest. And I wanted to mention especially the electronic Pearl Harbor or digital Pearl Harbor in this sense, because it really did get brought up a lot in this of you'd really lose if you suffered this digital Pearl Harbor. And it's very appropriate to mention in June 2016, because this month marks 25 years since we first uttered the word electronic Pearl Harbor. Wynne Schwarthow, in congressional testimony, June 25th, I believe, 1991, first used the phrase electronic Pearl Harbor. So again, and as we're thinking about the dynamics of cyber conflict, just think about that. For 25 of the 75 years since the actual Pearl Harbor, we've been warning about a digital Pearl Harbor. So for 25 years, we've been warning about this, and it hasn't occurred yet. We probably have a misunderstanding about the dynamics of cyber conflict and the nature of cyber power if we're still warning about it for 25 years. The other main category of winning looked at broad national security goals. And this you can check the paper. I'm not bringing the reference here. It certainly came up. Some people, like Dan Keel, would write about, well, if you lost in an early cyber loss could lead to a kinetic loss in a larger conflict. Certainly a lot of writing in here on Chinese espionage and also a little bit on Stuxnet from people like John Lindsay. To dive in, and to me this was the case study that I found really, really interesting and dynamic that really helped me think about this. And Estonia gets overused as a case in our field. I think we need more cases that we can really look at here, and that's why I like Brandon's work that he'll talk about next. But to me, Estonia was so interesting because I would have conversations, especially I was doing my history book, A Fierce Domain, that Ed mentioned, and we launched here at CyCon a few years back. The typical assessment that you hear, I even heard this specifically from one of the 4-star generals doing cyber in the United States, was, well, of course, Estonia got wiped off the net. Not really true, but I take the point. Right, Estonia lost because in the tactical engagement, the websites were taken down, right? And that's the normal narrative. Well, the websites got taken down, the email, the website for the legislature, the banks, and people focus on the tactical effects. Now, this isn't quite, I mean, unfortunately, yesterday you started to come out of this narrative a little bit. It's no surprise here in Tallinn that you get that. But almost always we're focusing in on this first category of achieving the tactical effects. And so if you can say who won, Russia or Estonia, the typical level analysis that I find almost always hits at just that first level of the tactical dynamics. I even had one high-ranking DoD official in the cyber policy office that went so far as to say, why are we even still talking about Estonia? This is a few years back. Why are we still even talking about Estonia? All they did was lose a cyber battle. Why is that still something that we find interesting to talk about? Fortunately, I think the Cyber Policy Office has come a long way yet. So just focus on the tactical dynamics and never going farther. So if you look at the operational dynamics, if the point of the cyber attacks was to coerce Estonia in the moving of the statue, Estonia still moved the statue. So even though we can say, yes, at the tactical and technical level, it was a win for the Russian attackers, because they did, in fact, achieve their tactical effect of taking down websites, it was an operational loss because they failed to coerce Estonia to not move the statue. And certainly at the strategic level, as got brought up yesterday, if you look at the relative power of each side, Estonians are now renowned for their cybersecurity expertise. NATO was woken up to the impact of what can happen with cyber attacks. And when you talk to the folks in Brussels, they say, boy, the wake-up call for us was really the Estonian attacks. It was really that put us on our guard. We learned the Russian tactics and what they do. So if you're looking at it from the Russian side, their adversaries, the Estonians, now rise with significantly more power. Your primary adversary, as Russia might see it, of NATO is now more warned, builds the center here in Tallinn. And so at the strategic level, if you're looking at the strategic dynamics, it's not even close. So even though the main dynamic that I hear in Washington, D.C. is that, of course, Russia won it. They took down the websites. At the operational strategic dynamics, it's not even close. The Estonians clearly won it. And so it really gets me in Washington, D.C. that we don't get past the actual level to look at the dynamics of cyber conflict. We can't tell at the level of the 4-star cyber general that I talked with. If he still focuses on the tactical and technical effects, he's still fighting from the he's fighting from the foxhole, right? He's looking at only the tactical effects. If we in the United States at the level of 4-star cyber generals can't tell the difference between a loss and a win, then we are fundamentally not understanding the dynamics of cyber conflict and the dynamics of cyber power. Why did Estonia win? And it's largely, to some degree, a defensible cyberspace. To some degree, they won because they had internet exchange point. That allowed them to have, that enabled some tactics that they might not have been able to do otherwise. Georgia didn't have an internet exchange point. It couldn't take some of those tactical and technical decisions that the Estonians did. But Estonia largely won because of the soft power reasons, of the Joe Nye reasons. Estonians speak English. They're part of an alliance. They had a lot of friends. They had private sector that was able to come and help out, groups like NSPSEC. All things that aren't normally considered in the American military sense of cyber power. When we folks in the American military think about cyber power, we're thinking about the hard aspects of cyber power. We don't think of alliances, friendships, speaking English, having very natty bow ties, and the rest that fit in as part of cyber power. And unfortunately, again, we really do need more case studies here. Estonia is the clearest where you can see those nice, tight distinctions between the tactical dynamics, operational, and strategic dynamics. It gets muddy when you start to get into other cases. In the paper I did explored Iran in some depth, but it gets muddy. I had actually some extra 1,000 words or so on Chinese espionage, but US-China espionage, but there it gets really so muddy that I had to chuck those pages. So the tactical dynamics, again, I'll only call out that for the most part, we only focus on the tactical dynamics when we're talking about this back and forth conflict between Iran on one side, the US, and sometimes Israel on the, or other nations on the other side. But we tend to treat them as a string of separate engagements. You know, well, what happened in the case of Stuxnet? What happened in the case of Shamoon? What happened in the case of the bank DDoS? And we don't look at it as a string of engagements within a longer campaign. But certainly when we look at the tactical dynamics, we say, okay, did Stuxnet, Shamoon, certainly tactical wins because they succeeded in taking down their target. But again, when I talk with even multiple star generals that run cyber in Washington, D.C., they'll talk, for example, about Shamoon. Well, what happened with Shamoon? Shamoon took down 30,000 computers, turned them into bricks. Incredibly dangerous attack, because look at what happened. When I look at the operational dynamics of, for example, Shamoon, I see a failed attack. I see a total failure. If, and this is an assumption, if the Iranians were doing Shamoon to try and disrupt energy production in the Gulf, they failed at that, if that was in fact their goal. They bricked 30,000 computers, a tactical win, but Saudi Aramco and Rasgas were able to fix those computers, bring them back up online, and it did not affect oil production, any energy production at all. And it didn't because the Iranians failed to restrike the target. So even though they brought it down the first time, they didn't do battle damage assessment to say they're bringing these computers back up and therefore we need to restrike. And that's why I think it gives us interesting implications for cyber power when we start looking at these as a string of engagements and start bringing ourselves up from the tactical and technical level of analysis. So it's certainly much tougher in this case to try and figure out who's winning or losing in the strategic sense because you've got this back and forth, punches being thrown on either side. So why is it so difficult? Why is thinking about winning been so elusive? And I think here the Iran case helps so much because we've got so much of this gray zone conflict going on, not just in cyber, but also special forces, drones, and the rest. Just like it's difficult for Washington, D.C. to come up and say, well, what's winning when we're with the Islamic State? It's just as difficult for them to think through what winning might be when we're looking at cyber conflict. I think also the military does it themselves. When you hear military folks talk about cyber capabilities, they're talking about tactical effects. And unfortunately, I've had many conversations, again, with 4 stars in Washington, D.C., where you can never really get away from that discussion about mere capabilities. And I think it's too bad, because we need to bring ourselves up over and above that. In the US, it's certainly tough, because we don't have an integrated cyber strategy. We've got separate strategies for defense, commerce, and the rest. Of course, the overclassification in this area. And also, we've got some very specific biases. This quote here was from General Alexander after, I believe he was retired at this point. And right, it's tough to figure out the nature of these conflicts and the nature of cyber power when he says, oh, that Stuxnet thing that happened to Iran, don't worry about that. That wasn't important. The really important one was Shamoon, which I think takes a very, very interesting viewpoint on that you don't hear from people that weren't actual protagonists. So when it comes to close out, when it comes to the recommendations, for those in the military especially, don't just focus on the engagements. Pull yourself out of the foxhole, pull yourselves out of the dogfight, and start thinking about what the air campaign looks like. Don't look at these as a string of engagements and start figuring out what the operational and the strategic dynamics of those are. Scholars, we need a deeper set of cases and case studies in this area. And again, when we do those case studies, we've got to focus on the campaigns, not on the single engagements. And for policymakers, I think one reason why it's been difficult for us to think through winning in this space, we have to step back. I'll take the United States, for example. Do we see winning in cyberspace as seizing the most digital hilltops that we possibly can? Seizing as many haystacks as we can so that we can find the needle in them, to use General Alexander's example? Or is winning having the most trusted cyber companies and having the most secure and digitally enabled economy? Or is winning taking advantage of this moment to win over the hearts and minds of the digital natives wherever they are in the world? You know, is it hard power, economic, or soft power that we're trying to achieve here? Because if it's either of those latter two, if it's economic or power or soft power, the way that we've been going about in the United States is almost all wrong. Because we've been going out and trying to seize as many digital hilltops as we possibly can, that might be undermining our power in those other two areas. So I do encourage in Washington, D.C. that we get one national strategy that helps us think through which of these three things that we're actually trying to achieve. Great. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Joe. I think that was the kind of model CyCon presentation, because there was a lot about Estonia, but all related into very big issues and decisions that need to be taken in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. I have to say, from a sort of journalistic and analytical point of view, of course, I entirely welcome the idea there will be lots more incidents and lots more case studies. As someone who actually worries about this, our security, the thought of lots more incidents and lots more case studies troubles me, because we may not always win the way we did in Estonia. But on that note, over to Brandon, who's going to look at the question of digital attacks and cyber conflicts as a means of coercion, with an adversary having its aim and the potential victim needing to avoid that aim being achieved. Over to you, Brandon.
All right, great. Thank you. So this is my first CyberCon, but this is my second talk, because yesterday I had to sub in for my graduate student co-author. So I got 2 talks down. So this will be it. And it's nice to build on Jay's work, because I've always liked Jason Healy's work, and I think he's going in the right direction. Well, I think if I agree with him, then I'm more confident that I'm going in the right direction, not that he's going in the right direction, because he has a lot more knowledge about this domain. And I always like the thing he says about how we have a deep history of cyber conflict, and we need to stop acting like this is a new domain. This isn't a new domain. We have 30, 35 years of experience, and that's something that I've been trying to push and trying to do in my work. I tackle it from a bit different angle, because I'm an academic, engaged in publication strategies and impact factors and refs and things like that. And I recently had the book with Ryan Manessa, Cyber War versus Cyber Realities. And in that, we kind of start to do what Jay Healy and other people have asked us to do, which is to scope the domain, to see what we can know, to try and understand as many cases as possible. So in that book, we look at rivalries, on the understanding that rivals would be the most likely states to use cyber conflict, and trying to understand what has been going on in the cyber domain in the context of rivalry. And I think this is a key thing we need to do. We need to understand context. We need to understand the international relations dynamics of cyber conflict, because these cyber conflicts are not isolated. They're part of the wider national foreign policy debate that has been going on. And we need to stop thinking about these things as something distinct and different. Cyber is a spectrum. Cyber is part of the foreign policy portfolio of states. And in that context, we can understand more about cyber than we generally think we can. The goal is to make considered policy judgments based on evidence, not speculation and conjecture. And I think we do that too much. We prognosticate too much. We think we're futurists a bit too much. And that's why history is so important, because there is a deep knowledge of what we can know about the recent past, which, as many would say, is the best predictor of the future. Of course, the future may change, but we can know about how things have worked very, very recently. Rather than suggesting the nature of combat has changed, though, we and other academics are interested in examining if, how, and why it has changed. We don't want to make assumptions about the changing nature of international relations without evidence, without looking at as many cases as possible. I think that's an important task we have in academia, and I'm very proud to see a new generation of scholars trying to move beyond the single case analysis, trying to look at as many regional scope dynamics as possible, trying to look at as many cases as possible, trying to think more clearly about causality, trying to think more clearly about critical studies, trying to think about issues such as gender, race, ethnicity, global positioning, regionalism. We need to bring this into cyber security and cyber conflict studies, and that's something I've been pushing for a long time. Now, this slide here is on the basic dynamics. This is based from the book, the 2015 Oxford book, which very nicely for them, they've made it only $9 on Kindle. So it's not the $90 Palgrave book. So that's very accessible for everyone. So, buy it yourself. Don't make the library buy it. But this is a reconceptualization of our data. And what we've done here is from 2001 to 2011, we looked at all cyber incidents and disputes. So we look at incidents which are isolated actions, and then we look at the sort of general kind of overall battle, so to speak, and that would be a dispute, which would be the constellation of actions within a limited time frame, a context of a relationship between two states. And what we generally found was overall a lack of cyber incidents over time. So this is what the graph shows here. And the interesting thing here that I've done differently is I've laid it out in comparison to espionage, disruption, and deception. And this is a key question Jason was getting at, and a key question other people have been getting at, is looking at coercion, moving towards looking at effectiveness. And if we think of cyber as part of the domain of foreign relations, in the domain of trying to change and achieve effects, we don't see a lot of actions that actually seek to change the behavior of the opposition. The great majority of cyber conflicts are espionage, disruption, and deception. And the other thing here, too, is if you look at the bottom, you can see a graph of average severity. Now, average severity is out of 10. It's not really an accurate comparison there. But the general takeaway there is that most cyber conflicts are very, very low level if you graph them over a severity scale of 10. Now, of course, we can all talk about data. We could talk about the limitations of data. We could talk about the limitations of collecting evidence. All data is biased. All data is a work in progress. We go through this very deeply in the book. But the other thing, too, is we're building towards collecting more and more data, and I'm working on grant proposals to look at data scraping and machine learning to get at greater cyber events data to kind of do what Jay was asking, to get as many cases as possible. But another important thing, too, to think about is there generally are a lack of responses in cyberspace when these cyber actions happen. The general conjecture is that when these conflicts occur, there will be a reaction. There will be repercussions. But the great majority of them, I think it's 88 here in the earlier data set, have no response. And then you have about, 17 that have a cyber response. And an MID is a conventional response. An MID is a threat, display, or use of force as coded by the Correlates of War Project. And we see very little actual conventional responses or conventional contexts to cyber disputes. So the most obvious example would be the Georgia conflict in 2008, but there are very few other besides that. The other thing, too, is this is just data. I've been doing a lot of data work recently. The only thing you really need to understand here or see here is there is only really a clear effect on the foreign policy relations if you're looking at conflict and cooperation levels between states. If you see a DDoS attack or an attack to change behavior. So there are negative repercussions. So this is an interesting example in that the most severe action, the action trying to change a behavior, leads to a dramatic negative change in the relationship between two states. But the other thing here is that the least impactful, the easiest action, also leads to a negative reaction between the two states. But all the other categories, all the other variables, see no actual kind of impact. And the most interesting thing we found here, and this is from an Armed Forces and Society article in 2015 by Maness and Valeriano, we find that if you break this out by dyads, you see some interesting results, whereas if you look at, say, China attacking America, actually relations between China and America get more peaceful. They get better. And I was wondering, what is going on here? Why did that happen? And the reality is, if you think about it, what does happen when China attacks America? We have a summit, we have agreements, we have exchanges, we do everything nice states do to each other. And that's not what we had expected in this era of cyber conflict. We're seeing something dramatically different, which is what I'm leading towards here. So building on Jay's work, we're looking now at cyber coercion. And Ryan Maness and Ben Jensen and I have a book on cyber coercion that's due at the end of the summer and should be out early next year on Oxford University Press. But we're looking now at cyber war or cyber conflict as a political instrument, because war is a political instrument. The goal of the operations are driven by political objectives. But the question would be, are the weapons suited for achieving advances on the battlefield, either military or diplomatically? And if they're not, then we need to rethink the place of cyber conflict in the global international relations discourse. For cyber weapons, the result could be they're more useful in the imagination or fiction, rather than effective means of altering the distribution of power. So a lot of people make conjecture about the idea that weak states can use cyber conflict to achieve victory, that non-state actors can use cyber conflict to achieve victory. But I don't think the story is that clear-cut. I don't think the story works that well once you look at as many cases as possible. And if cyber coercion is not an effective measure of marshaling power, either by the state or the non-state actor, we then must rethink the importance of cyber, quote unquote, and its centrality to warfighting and diplomacy. We need to rethink what cyber really is and think of new theories, which I'll kind of end on in a second. So this is new data. We go from 2000 to 2014, and we do include some non-state actors and non-state targets in this new version of the data set. But the interesting thing here is, once again, you don't see that many cyber conflicts. You see an uptick in 2007, an uptick in 2010, but it's kind of generally low level overall. But it's very clear that the contours of the cyber domain are generally dictated by espionage and disruption, not by compel and deniance activities. These would be the activities to change the behavior of the enemy. We see very few cases of this. We only see 16 cases of this. Someone asked me, well, why don't we dive in on those 16 cases? The thing is, I didn't know about those 16 cases unless we had scoped the entirety of the domain. So now we can move towards doing what Jay was saying and looking at these cases and diving in deeper and looking at the strategic, tactical, and operational level to understand just really is what is going on. Because we can know things about the cyber domain. A lot of what happens in cyberspace and in the digital arena is overt. There are a lot of things that are secret, but the things that are secret don't generally impact the foreign policy dynamics of states. And that's generally what we're talking about here. We're talking about changing behavior. We're talking about changing the international relations sphere. And that's what the critical question is. So here we're looking at effectiveness here, and what you see is that quite often compel and deniance activities overall fail. I think 15 of the 16 fail. But you see a general level of success for espionage and disruption. So the activity in cyberspace and in cyber conflict would be it would be better if academics and scholars and policymakers kind of shift gears a bit and stop looking at cyber war and stop looking at cyber conflict. Of course, I'm one of the problems, but I wanted to know what the contours of the domain were, and I think we need to move to something new. This is just more data. I just wanted to show that you can do data. It's possible. And the interesting thing here is looking at compel and deniance activities. Here you find that 2 are impactful or successful. But just based on the contours of the data, you would expect to have 10.4. So we see cyber to be less successful than we would expect to, just by chance. And this is a problem, is that we assume that the cyber domain has a lot of effects. We assume that a lot is going on, that a lot is changing. But we're not really seeing that so far. Given the preliminary findings, we're only at the beginning of the era of cyber power, there could be a lot more to come, we must consider caution in operations. The effectiveness of new weapons is often overestimated. These are new toys. These are new things we want to use. We think they can be dramatic, but also as we've been looking at the history of air power, we are a lot more considered about how useful air power was. Or even thinking about the tank and how useful a tank was until the advent of blitzkrieg theory. So we need to rethink about the nature of cyber weapons and what they're useful. And if they're not effective for coercive intent, what are they good for? And I think what we really missed the boat on, and this builds on what Michael Libicki was saying yesterday, is that there's a clear advantage that comes with espionage and disruption. Disruption in terms of disrupting your adversary, or disrupting their information networks, or instilling information. That we need to move back to information warfare, and that we need to move away from the cyber warfare claim, because I don't really think we're seeing an era of cyber war. That the options in achieving coercive intent don't really work. But the other thing too is, if we are looking at cyber as a domain of espionage and disruption, just what good is it? Does it have any value? Is it really important? Is it really useful? What was more dramatic for American, for American espionage activities in relation to China? All the hacking that's been going on, or leaving that helicopter behind after the bin Laden raid and all that sensory equipment that was captured there? We need to think about basic levels of espionage and how it affects international relations dynamics and how cyber fits into that. We also need to think more about the nature of weapons and how they fit in the international conflict environment. I think one of the problems we have with cyber conflict is, just like the nuclear domain, in some ways it's kicking the can down the road. We're doing anything and everything we can to not really solve the root causes of conflict. And we really need to think at what is dividing states, what's bringing states apart, and what we can do to bring them together. And cyber isn't obviously a very viable path. We need to get to the root cause of conflict. But overall, in general, I think in academia, policy, and all realms of cybersecurity research, we need to move to data and evidence. We have done 20 years of research on single case studies. We do these studies where you use a case to develop a theory, then you test that same theory with the same case. That's just bad social science. We need to think more about evidence and what we can know in cyberspace, because I think we can know about this fragile domain. And to understand how to protect it and to keep it safe and to keep it functioning, we need to understand the contours of the domain, which I think we've done a very poor job on. And I'm hopeful for the future, and that we'll see a lot more people do great research that can lead us into better directions. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Brandon. I'm very intrigued by this idea that it's only the attacks we know about that can have worked. I suppose it's conceptually possible that you might have coercive attacks which are clandestine and affect the way decision makers behave, but the public never knows about them. But we can get onto that in discussion. In the meantime, Keir, over to you.
Thank you, Everett. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I shall be picking up on some of the themes that Brandon and Jay have already introduced and elaborating on them. But if we're talking about lessons learned from cyber conflicts, one of the first things I must do is recommend strongly, if you haven't seen it before, this publication, Cyber War in Perspective, issued by CCDCOE, edited by Kenneth Gears, sitting here modestly in the second row, and containing a substantial contribution of articles by serious experts on precisely this topic, including by Jay Healy, plus a little something from myself. It is, I'm told by the center now, unavailable in hard copy, but it is available in soft copy online, or just buy me a drink afterwards. One of the themes that's come out for me strongly is the continuing need to argue for thinking more broadly about cyber effects in conflict, when they're faced in conjunction with other challenges which our side still tends to categorize as distinct and separate, but which adversaries are successfully integrating. We shouldn't still be needing to argue that there's no such thing as pure cyber, even the poster child events. Let me pick up a couple that have already been referred to extensively just in this panel. Stuxnet. So often you hear this was a pure cyber event, forgetting that it was taking place in conjunction with a sustained campaign of murders of Iranian nuclear scientists. Going a bit further back in history, Estonia, May 2007, thought of usually by people who've come late to this domain as a mainly cyber event. But let's think back to how Heli Tirmakla, the Estonian cyber coordinator at the time, described her experience of, with everything else that was going on at the same time, the last thing anybody wanted to hear was a geek coming into the room and saying, by the way, we're under cyber attack as well. So by all means, let's decide that cyber is a domain of warfare as opposed to something which pervades all other domains. But the experience of recent conflict is that any dividing lines between cyber and other manifestations of warfare are becoming increasingly blurred and irrelevant. In Crimea, we had the interaction between cyber and information ops and kinetic operations, which turned on their head Western notions of which of those facilitate which. In eastern Ukraine, we see integration between cyber information operations, electronic warfare, electronic attack, practicing this integration and blend on land there, in the air in Syria for an immediate boost to Russian combat capability. Integrated with a hard kill capability, this allows Russians to deliver artillery rounds on new targets in startlingly short timeframes. It is all blended, it is all a means of negating the advantages in combat which Western militaries have taken for granted for a generation. One of the few Russian generals that is still talking to us says that on the basis of the experience of eastern Ukraine and Syria, now the information domain in the broad Russian sense, that includes cyber, makes up 50% of mission planning in their operations. Let's take the specific example of UAV operations, of drone operations. The paper which I co-authored for this conference was focusing on neutralizing adversary UAVs by electronic means in particular, including by GPS spoofing. There's an argument that that kind of attack constitutes electronic warfare rather than pure cyber. But for me, if it means producing a hostile effect by introducing compromised data into an operating system, that's a reasonable definition of a cyber attack rather than electronic. And what we're seeing here is what Martin Libicki referred to yesterday as the convergence of ISR, PSYOPs, EW as military operations within cyberspace. This is now recognized within the warfighting domain because Western militaries have started to respond to the capabilities and approach that are demonstrated by Russia and reported back by the training teams which are working with the Ukrainian military by reassessing their own strengths and vulnerabilities and testing them, as with, for example, exercise Strong Punch, which concluded just a few days ago, training for countering the new capabilities that they've woken up to. But it is also relevant far more broadly than just combat operations in indirect and undeclared warfare and in measures short of war, because the lines are blurred not only with warfighting domains, but also with political, economic, societal, legal tools of influence. This reinforces the points that have been made by Jay and Brandon. There's no such thing as pure cyber defeat or victory. Now, the organizers, when putting together this panel, pointed out entirely correctly that it's not all about Russia. Unfortunately, we do have to take an interest in Russia simply because that is the country which is preparing most urgently and actively for impending conflict. In London today at Chatham House, there is a serious conference underway called Russian State Mobilization, Moving the Country Onto a War Footing. Now, I'm not there because I'd much rather be here, but if an organization that is as pacific and idealist as Chatham House is using that kind of language, that says to me this is time to take this fairly seriously. As it was put in March by US Director of National Intelligence James Clapper, Russia is assuming a more assertive cyber posture based on its willingness to conduct operations even when detected and under increased public scrutiny. Put another way, they see the problem as sufficiently urgent that they just don't care anymore. That lack of restraint expresses itself across a broad spectrum, including seeking out our vulnerabilities, finding methods of denying communications, practicing anti-satellite weapons techniques, finding ways of denying GPS, targeting physical communications infrastructure, plus, of course, the background noise of intelligence collection being stepped up. This is already producing effects. If we take the example of the F-35, the new Joint Strike Fighter, besides the publicized issue with its software and vulnerabilities, plans for its operations in UK airspace are, quote, strongly handcuffed by collectors sitting in the North Sea, unquote. If that's the case for the UK, think how much more so for other European operators of the F-35, with much more constrained airspace. The Russian main directorate for deepwater research, GUGI, one of whose main tasks is actually carrying out these attacks on physical infrastructure in order to conduct cyber attacks and collect information, has emerged, surfaced, if you like, from being deeply, deeply classified to something which is now in the public domain simply because it has stepped up its activities so intensely and has now become visible. Now you have this further dimension, cyber campaigns as part of the indirect warfare deck, which is aimed at results not just limited to the cyber domain, and which may not be immediately obvious. What I mean by that is, in the same way as Russian disinformation campaigns are not intended to sell a specific narrative always, so Russian cyber activities may not always be intended to achieve a direct objective. And here I'd like to take the example of Sweden. The recent pattern of unexplained incidents which cross boundaries between cyber and physical domains speak to both Brandon's and Jay's presentations about definitions of success and failure and considering what the objectives might actually be. These incidents, which affect emergency communication systems, air traffic control, the rail travel booking system, banking and payment systems, media, even though that was good old-fashioned DDoS, and physical damage to communications infrastructure, are officially unrelated. And it is unproven and officially denied that this is the result of unfriendly action by an external power, even though few credible alternative explanations have been provided. But if you view this through the prism of Russian objectives, that's not really important. Because unsubstantiated stories of Russian involvement, which are now spreading, work for Moscow by eroding trust in institutions and potentially undermining social cohesion in the same way as the well-funded and well-publicized disinformation campaigns do. So if any adversary can cause it to be widely believed that it was them at work, whether or not it's true, then the effect in terms of loss of security confidence and trust is pretty much the same. Also, in the case of Sweden, it has the effect of reinforcing the hostile messaging from Moscow regarding any possible NATO membership. Now, we all know that that is counterproductive. The more Moscow pushes, the more Sweden realizes it needs allies. But let's not forget that that only causes surprise to Moscow. The interdependencies between domains, the cyber and the kinetic and the informational and economic and social, provide a different mix of vulnerabilities in different countries. But in all cases, coordination between all of these aspects is critical for defenders. Government and civil agencies and organizations and corporations that may not think they are anything to do with interstate conflict. Which brings me back to the opening point. By all means, let's designate cyberspace as an operational domain for NATO, as long as this is not, in NATO style, considering a declaration an acceptable substitute for action. The time for admiring the problem is long ago past, and there is no use treating it as a separate domain if the defenses within that domain are still designed to counter an inadequate spectrum of threats. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much indeed for that, Keir, for broadening our focus, and also for your admirable comment at the end that the time for admiring the problem has long passed. I was talking to someone about the NATO summit and saying, what's the goal in terms of cyber at the NATO summit? And the answer was, we need a headline. And I thought, well, a headline would be jolly nice. I hope we get a bit more than that in due course. So now it's time to take some contributions from the floor. Please don't be shy. However battered you may be feeling after the enjoyments of last night, stick your hand up. We have roving microphones. I have a question for Keir, which I will pose about Twitter, because I'm very struck by the way in which Russia has been able to intimidate Twitter, and how that was a tactical success, but I would say a strategic failure. Does anyone here follow the parody accounts Darth Putin KGB and Sputnik Not? Yeah, well, you were missing something. This is, okay, so these are a parody accounts which make fun of various leading Russian officials, the president, his press spokesman, the main Russian news agency dealing with foreign affairs, which is called Sputnik. And they say things that sort of sound like something that Putin could have said, but it's actually a fake. So, for example, Russian defense spending is being cut. Russian attack spending, however, remains unchanged. And this comes out underneath the picture of Putin. And it's clearly not Putin. But anyway, the Russians complained to Twitter. And they said, this is unfair, and we want these. And Twitter suspended all these accounts. This is on Tuesday. Without any consultation. The people who run these accounts got notifications, your account's been suspended. And so in the short term, that looked like a Russian success. They've got these annoying accounts which have, 40, 50, 60,000 followers, so they're not trivial. And they were off Twitter. Great, declare victory. But then what happened was that people like me started kicking up a fuss, and first of all Radio Free Europe, and then Quartz and BuzzFeed, and finally the Financial Times all wrote about this. And Twitter, from having thought, I think, that they were just solving a problem, realized they'd actually created a problem. And once it's in the Financial Times, and I think in the end it was in the other big papers as well, they were forced to reinstate these accounts because Twitter says quite clearly that parody accounts are allowed as long as they're clearly labeled as parodies. And so these accounts all came back, and of course they came back with tens of thousands of extra followers, the so-called Streisand effect, where you try and cover something up on the internet and end up attracting attention. But I want to ask Keir, I know you're quite critical of Twitter. That would probably be one thing that they got wrong. But how does Twitter and social media fit into this sort of contested domain of info/cyber?
I think what we've got here is a fascinating example of the interplay between different main domains that I was mentioning, because here you have an example where an online effect has been brought about by other means. So it's reverse cyber, if you like. So as we know, Russia employs battalions of trolls whose purpose is to suppress online dissent and prevent objective commentary on its actions. Now, Moscow has briefly persuaded or induced Twitter to do exactly the same thing on its behalf, but in a more direct manner, by banning these parody accounts which the Kremlin finds too close to the truth. And one point that I would emphasize about that, close to the truth, is entirely accurate. You mentioned making fun, but this is actually extremely clever, pointed, and politically savvy satire, to the extent that it is sometimes quite difficult to tell at first glance which is the parody account and which is the Russian Ministry of Affairs actually parodying itself by saying things which are obviously untrue. In that respect, what I would suggest to you is that what we've seen is a brief, successful denial of service attack by Russia, by removing access to an important stream of information, by suppressing freedom of expression. As to whether it is a success or failure, it's a temporary success, but I think we need to see it in conjunction with the other preparations that are being made by Russia for online activity, particularly in the domain of social media. And here I would refer back to the research that has been undertaken by the neighboring Center of Excellence in Riga, Strategic Communications Center of Excellence, on the capabilities that are being stockpiled for influencing social media en masse by means of trolls and bots. I think what we have seen here is just one flash of the capabilities that could be deployed to great effect briefly in a period of crisis. And with that in mind, we need to take careful note.
Yes, I think that's a really interesting point, because these bot accounts, automated, we call them eggs, because they're people who don't put up a photo, it's just a little Twitter egg. And they can be used to take down a Twitter account by complaining en masse. And Twitter works basically on an algorithmic basis as a first stage. If enough people complain about an account, well, then you take it down first and then worry about the problems later. So by creating that capability, they're cleverly exploiting the way in which Twitter works. Brandon, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say something quick, though. I think one problem we have is that we're generally focused on the impact of states and diplomats and policymakers, and we're not looking at the wider societal impact. And this is the tragic thing about the new domain of Twitter, in that we can't really look at sentiment anymore. The sentiment is dictated by states. And we need to really think about the individual and what the impact of these conflicts are on the individual. And I don't know how we really get at that now because of social media probably being closed off as an academic mode of investigation. Now that you have to buy all these, all the tweets, and now all the tweets are driven by certain actors. And this is a problem, but we need to rethink what we're doing and how the individual comes into play.
Good. Let's have some points on the floor. I think I saw a couple of hands going up, although the lights are very bright, and I may have maybe an optical illusion. So please, if you want to make a point, just introduce yourself briefly and say who you are, where you're coming from. Is that so you've got a white shirt there? No? You were just scratching your head. Now you've put your hand down again. That's fine. That's allowed too.
Oh, Edward, if you have no further questions from the audience for the moment, maybe we could expand a little bit on this problem of it's not just the eggs.
It's not just the
on
eggs.
Twitter. You mentioned the ones without photographs. The ones with photographs, particularly the notorious bikini trolls,
Yes.
are likely to be more of a problem. But
So hands up. Everyone here know what bikini trolls are? Is there anyone here who doesn't know what a bikini troll is? Okay, please explain what a bikini troll is.
This is the one point at which I would have quite liked to have a slide, because I could have shown you my large number of followers with Russian names, young ladies who forgot to get dressed before taking their profile pictures. Bikini trolls are
Actually, they're actually bez bikini trolls, without bikinis.
It's a system of trolls and bots which, as the researchers in Riga put it, target a particularly vulnerable social group, men over the age of 45. They are designed to gather followers by posting pictures, which apparently men over the age of 45 find quite interesting. By doing so, they avoid most of the usual problems with setting up a bot campaign, which is being detectable by quantitative analysis, by figuring out what the links are, because they acquire real-life followers and interaction. Now, they are at the moment largely inactive. But if they do acquire a sufficient critical mass on Twitter, then they can conduct the kind of campaign that we have just been talking about. This is a substantial problem in time of crisis, because if you can hijack Twitter even for a limited period, this goes a long way towards achieving your information operations aims.
Jay, did you want to comment on social? You didn't touch on social media in your presentation, but I know you do tweet and tweet very well. How does social media fit into your framework of analysis?
Mostly been as an academic and finding new ways to try and to express myself. Almost never with a bikini, and I enjoy following everyone here on the panel. Actually, yeah, because it's just such an expressive way to get our message across. When I come out with something and trying to find, I wish I did more tweeting before I actually publish something, because trying to find that 140 character way to get something across, I find actually really improves my writing.
Yeah, I suppose one of the key things here is the anonymity that it allows you to create anonymous social media accounts reflects actually the kind of deeper anonymity in the way the internet is constructed. Right at the very beginning, we separated IP addresses from any sort of, they stopped becoming real identifiers. And most of the problems we have in cyberspace, and actually most of the capabilities we have in offensive cyberspace, all revolve around being able to do things anonymously, about being able to disguise who you are and where you come from. Also, of course, all the problems we have with attribution, and when we want to do a kinetic response to that. But I think, was that a hand at the back there? Sorry. Yes, go ahead, Kenneth. Go ahead. And I think there's also a question at the back, but I can't quite see it. But let's have Kenneth first. Kenneth Gears, the editor of this excellent book, which Keir plugged, on lessons from Ukraine. Go ahead, Keir.
Yeah, I'd say that some of this is perhaps conflict related in the international relations. The real conflict is the internet now that it's gone out of the dark web of academia into the world. And now it's Russia, China, Iran, Belarus, etc. Is it more for keeping a dictator in power or removing a dictator? And how will that play into international norms of destabilization of states?
That's a very good, broad question. Is the internet a tool for stability or instability, for keeping dictators in power, which I suppose counts as stability, or removing them, which counts as instability? Jay?
Yeah, it's really been fascinating to watch over the last 5 years. At first, Yevgeny Morozov was one of the few that was kind of coming out and making that point, especially before Egypt happened. And all of a sudden we realized that this tool that we thought, in our very, especially in the United States, in our liberal libertarian fashion, about how this tool was going to come out and be enlightening, and this tool of freedom, in the way that it has this significantly darker side to it. And that's why I really liked Thomas Rid's book that he talked about yesterday, Rise of the Machines, because he really talks about the cypherpunks and Timothy Leary and everyone else, and how this new cyberspace was going to raise us to a different kind of human being and a different kind of humanity, and really ignoring that dark side of how it does aid oppression. And we really saw this, I think, especially in Syria, where originally the Syrian protesters and others would use these tools like Twitter, Facebook, in the same way they did in Egypt, to get their act together, to organize, to get out their message, to know when to meet up and have physical protests, not knowing how they were opening themselves up to being physically targeted, captured, arrested, tortured, because of what they were posting online and the way that the nations could use it.
We've got a question here in the front, 4 rows back on my right-hand side. But Brandon, do you want to come briefly on that?
I want to follow up on Jay's point too, and I think that's where I want my work to go now, because we're not finding a lot of evidence of cyber conflict. We're not finding a lot of evidence of cyber coercion and cyber victory. But what we are seeing is these tools are being used by states to repress individuals, to repress protesters, to repress journalists. And I think that's where we need to go if we're going to start to look at cybersecurity, is to move away from this international conflict frame and to look more at this domestic impact frame. I think that's where these tools are really going to be leveraged, and they will be most effective in that framework. But we're not paying a lot of attention to that so far.
And that's why I love the work of Rafal Rohazinski and others, Citizen Lab and University of Toronto Monk Center, and then there's just been a lot of good work that's been coming out on that I really admire.
Excellent. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Kuba Mačák, University of Exeter. Last year here at CyCon, you said that one of the main threats coming out of this ongoing disinformation campaign is the risk that through affecting public opinion, the policy making in the NATO countries will be infiltrated or affected as well. And so I wonder, 1 year later, how has that changed, in your opinion, perhaps also the opinion of the speakers on the panel? Are we really facing a risk that, as you said last year, that unanimity for Article 5 purposes within NATO countries could be lost because of this ongoing disinformation campaign? Or has this spectre become further far in the meantime? Thank you.
The spectre of disinformation.
Thanks, Kuba. Yes. There are two different trends which are competing, I think, in this competition over the last year. On the plus side, there is now greater awareness than we had this time last year of exactly what the problem is. So much has been written by so many people now about the disinformation problem that you would hope that the level of awareness among those whose job it is to make sure that disinformation does not achieve that crossover from public opinion space to policy-making space is sufficient to make sure that that happens. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, we have the passage of time and the extremely short institutional memories of the organizations that we're dealing with. And to give you just one example of how dramatically that raised awareness can tail off and fall away, if you think back to the announcement by President Putin that Russian forces were withdrawing from Syria, everybody thought that this was true.
No, not absolutely everybody.
Sorry. Most people in the media, with the exception of Edward, thought that this was true, that if President Putin said Russian troops were going somewhere, that meant they were actually going somewhere, having forgotten that over the course of the previous 2 years, he'd probably demonstrated that almost certainly the opposite was true. So this was a successful way of presenting an establishment of a permanent overseas presence as a withdrawal. And you've probably had the same experience. The first 48 hours of media interviews we were doing were saying, well, actually, just have a look at what's really happening in real life instead of what the Russian information machine is putting out. So two different things are going on. On the one hand, people know this is happening. On the other hand, people need to be constantly reminded about it. But the one prescription that I come back to again and again, because often the follow-up question is what exactly can be done, is what counter-disinformation measures require is public engagement at a very senior level. Those nations, and this includes some small nations bordering Russia, those nations which have publicly acknowledged the threat enable their media, their society, their policymakers to actually deal with it. Those that do not have a much greater challenge.
And of course, I mean, you're talking about impacting on decision making, and one thing is presenting a different reality which decision makers react to. The other is confusion and distraction. And I've just come back from Washington, where people are still looking at this extraordinary business of the fake refinery explosion, which was a very strange information attack conducted over social media with a mixture of news websites and tweets, making out that there'd been a major industrial accident, I think in Louisiana. Nothing of the kind has happened. And this was written about in the New York Times, I think, back in January. People are still trying to work out, this was clearly some kind of test or exercise or dummy for can you create a public panic. It was pretty clear it was Russia doing it, but people still don't really know what the scenario was, what the parameters of the exercise. But clearly this would have had an effect on if it was happening at a time of other tension. You can imagine it would be distracting decision makers from focusing on the main thing. Yes.
I think the key word you used there is test.
Yeah.
It's a test of operational capability by those structures that are planning to do this, which runs alongside other tests that have been happening. What you don't see is people linking together the apparently isolated incidents that have been taking place in cyber and related domains. For example, the mass telephoning of Polish military officers. 10,000 at a time receive a phone call from Russia. It's a test, but of what? What we need to be aware of is the capabilities that are being developed and, as I mentioned before, stockpiled for use in a crisis.
Brandon and Jay may want to come back on that in a moment, but let's take Lisa first.
Thank you. I'm Lisa Past, and I'm with the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence. And this being a panel on lessons learned from cyber conflicts, you've spent an awful lot of time on whether we call it information warfare, stratcom, public affairs, or anything else, but on the communications side of the shop. And what keeps striking me throughout these discussions, not just this morning, is how cyber and the information and comms side are often viewed separately. Whereas it's quite clear that we live in a world where politically motivated cyber attacks only become meaningful once they're communicated. That's their exploit, almost in a way. So in the next few years, where do you see that overlap or that interaction of information or comms on one side and then cyber on the other side go? And do you see that becoming more integrated, both as state activities or politically motivated activities, but also in academic research?
Excellent. Well, I think we'll all have something to say on that. But I would push back a little bit. Isn't it, it's at least theoretically possible that you could have a cyber attack that isn't communicated, which is just extremely scary, and something happens on decision makers' computers that makes them think, because they see something is done to them on their computers, which affects their decision making, and the public never finds out about it. I just put that into the up for discussion. But Jay, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the point of Stuxnet was, that was not to communicate it. I mean, as soon as it was communicated, it became ineffective at what it was looking to do. Certainly in the United States, it bothers me when I hear policymakers or military officers say, well, cyber will be part of every next conflict, which I guess is probably true, but I think it misses the nature of how it might be used in that next conflict. As we heard from Martin Levicki yesterday, we used to have a concept 25 years ago of information warfare, and we took apart those pieces of information warfare so that we could triple down our bets on cyber. And in a way that I don't think has served us very well. Because we were so worried about cyber being part of the next war, it kind of hasn't. I mean, if you look at Putin in Ukraine, we would have been much better off if we would have stayed with an integrated concept of information warfare and information operations the way he has. Integrating electronic warfare, information warfare, some cyber, including on the battlefield. I think the United States is much less prepared for that than we would have been in the late 1990s. Likewise, we still haven't convinced the Muslim world that in the United States that this isn't about them and their religion. They still think 9/11 is an inside job because we've been so bad at getting across a message. I think in part because we've been so focused on cyber. So I certainly don't think in the US that we're going to get any better at integrating these because we are full off cybering ourselves up, right? I mean, the military academies, the staff colleges, Everybody is fully going down the cyber track, especially the offensive cyber track, because it's the sexiest, and I think kind of ignoring the problems that we're facing right now.
Brian.
I think one of the key things we've missed too is we talk a lot about resiliency, but we don't really look at it too well. We don't really look at how to build resiliency, and I think that's the problem with information warfare, is that if we're going to talk about cyber conflict information warfare, the real effect would be on the individual and the decline of trust and the rise of stress and the biological reactions that come with the dependency we now have on the internet, that we all now have like 4 attack points on our bodies because we have cell phones and everything else. And that has led to real physiological changes. And Michael Gross and others in Israel have been doing some great work on this, and we're developing some grant proposals to do these experiments and look at stress and cortisol reactions and how to alleviate them, and looking at the populations in the US and the UK. But I think that's work that needs to be done, is looking at how we can strengthen the individual and let them build trust in the internet, because that's clearly declining.
Kia.
I risk getting very, very boring about this because I have been hammering away at this on stage at every CyCon since 2009. But those who have heard me say it 2 or 3 times before, please close your ears. The problem is that we have still not quite caught up with what the adversary wants to do to us. China, Russia, and those countries that think like them about information, and let's not forget there is a substantial constituency out there that does think in that mindset, believes that the dividing line between information communications and cyber that you've described is entirely artificial. And it is the information itself which is important, and the means of transmission is secondary. So cyber is just the technical representation of information. You can transmit information online or in a newspaper or by walking up to somebody on the street and telling them. All of these are things that we have seen demonstrated in recent conflicts. But stovepiping and focusing on cyber alone leaves us ill-equipped to deal with the fact that this is an integrated problem. You've reminded me of a very optimistic phrase in the CCDCOA book, Cyber Warfare in Perspective, which suggested that observance of what has been taking place in recent cyber campaigns could bring about, quote, a transformation of cyber doctrine in the West, unquote. Hoping that there might actually be the realization that you cannot just sit in your bunker and focus on bits flowing. You have to see it as an integrated picture, because that is exactly how the adversary sees it. This brings us back to the point that, that Kenneth made about cyber, social media, anything online, as a tool for removing dictators from power. This is something that has never been forgotten by some of the more serious authoritarian regimes. And after the demonstration of capabilities in the Arab Spring and elsewhere, this is the reason why the security structures in those countries have won the argument over commercial interests, over human rights, over NGOs, and therefore are clamping down and very effectively putting in place defenses against what they call breaches of national information space. In other words, protecting against anything that we might wish to do in order to reach their populations with alternative narratives to what is state-sponsored in their own countries. So I come back to the first point. If we do assess that there is a need for convergence between all of these different domains, we are simply catching up with the rest of the world.
I just want to push back a little bit on this idea that it's, I mean, I absolutely agree that the dividing line is artificial between information and cyber, but there are things that can be extremely effective which have almost no information dimension at all. If Stuxnet had succeeded, if it hadn't been spotted, if it had been slightly better from a technical point of view, it would never have come up on these other computers. It would have had exactly the effect that was desired within Iran, and the only people who would have known about it in Iran would have been the people running NATAZ and the leadership. And it might not even have been apparent to them why things had gone wrong. They would have just said, our centrifuges aren't working for reasons we can't understand. It must be a cyber attack. We don't really, and it would, yeah, eventually they might have had success with the forensics. And it seems to me that that's an example of if you like, of a pure attack which has no, I mean, America chose to give that an information dimension by gloating about it once it was in the wild by accident. But that was 2 separate steps away from the original plan, which was to be devastating and in secret.
Well, 2 points there. First, coming back to Jay's lament that we have left behind the integrated concept of information operations. Recalling a phrase from those days, successful information operations by the adversary looked like your own bad admin. That's the definition of success, and you've just hit on it, not knowing what has actually taken place. I am sure that there are plenty of other examples sitting in the classified domain which we could refer to where that has actually happened. But if we come back to the current case study of what is going on in Sweden, there is a sufficient pattern of incidents to deduce that there must be something behind it. But because up until this point it has been sufficiently successful that no smoking gun has been found, I think that satisfied your description. But it also shows that you cannot treat them in isolation, because these are intended to have effects which spread well beyond the cyber domain, and they're having physical, real-world effects which are now beyond the cyber domain. This is affecting real people right now.
I just wonder, before I come to Jay and Brand, is there anyone in the audience from Sweden? Hands up, all the Swedes here. Don't feel you have to comment, but if you would like to say, do you feel these incidents that we've seen in the press, which Kier's referred to in the last couple of weeks, ranging from television towers falling over through to all these other things, do you feel you're under cyber attack? Do you feel this is part of it?
We need the mic
yes.
down there.
The mic here. A microphone, please.
Okay.
Thanks, Maureen.
Sure. Well, without having any information in detail whatsoever, I do not have a smoking gun. What I do note, and that has something to do with what the president said yesterday about the trust in a system. So never mind what causes the incidents. The trust is getting eroded and somebody can use it. And that is what I do see as a problem.
That's really interesting. And of course, that chimes with one of the main messages of these Russia propaganda sites like RT and Sputnik, which spend most of their time not promoting Russia, but just spreading doubt and dismay. Their message is a kind of very tabloidy one that basically nothing works, public services are falling apart, criminals are everywhere, don't trust the politicians, they're incompetent and liars. And this has an effect of making people feel there's nothing really to fight for, that doom and gloom are inevitable, and of course erodes the security culture and public trust in decision makers. And I see these kind of random sort of bizarre things that are happening in Sweden as really being the sort of kinetic side of that sort of propaganda attack. Jay, I don't know if you've been to Sweden recently, but how does this strike you, what we're just talking about?
Don't know enough about it yet, but looking forward to catching up on it.
Yeah, more research needed. Any more? Yes, there's a question there. Go ahead. Another Swede. Yes.
It doesn't work here, but
It does tap it. It'll work. Yeah, it's working.
oh, okay. It's of course it's a very odd thing when 3-4 incidents happen simultaneously, especially with the 2 or 3 cyber related. But there is no smoking gun. And I talked to the responsible guy at our Civil Contingencies Agency yesterday. And all these things happened when it was upgrading going on for different systems. It was not connected. You haven't found on the digital side anything that could be correlated. But normally, 3 things in the same week, it shouldn't be coincidence. But apparently, you haven't found anything that's linked these incidents together. So that's the fact for the moment. Sorry.
Let's hope so. That's excellent. Yes, there's a quick question. Gentleman there, go ahead, sir. Yes, just tap it. It's working.
Staff is working. I have a general question for anybody on the panel.
And can you just introduce yourself, whether or not you're Swedish?
Not Swedish. I'm Martin Lipicki. The guy. Anyway. Can you signal with...
It's Martin. Hello. Sorry, I didn't recognize you.
You didn't recognize me? I'm in disguise. Can you send a signal with a cyber attack or a cyber incident if you don't have a backup narrative? that is a state-created, essentially, narrative of how you participate in cyberspace or something like that? In other words, can you send a signal without that doesn't say anything if you haven't said anything before that gives context to the signal?
How do you set the context to the signal here?
Yes, where do we start? This risks going against everything I've been saying about there being no such thing as pure cyber intervention. I think I grasp the point that you're aiming at, which is that if an isolated cyber event with nothing surrounding it is not going to be either meaningful or effective and not convey the desired meaning to the adversary. I could imagine there might be a circumstance under which you could do so by making the intervention, making the tools, the information weapons, so very specific that it is clear both who the originator is and who the message is. But overall, I'd agree with the point I think that you might want to make, which is that it has to be placed in context, and there does need to be the remains of the narrative, the remains of the information campaign, the announcement and the signaling, which actually enables and multiplies the effect of the actual cyber intervention.
I mean, to take an extreme example, if we have a time of international tension and the United States wishes to convey a message to Mr. Putin that the nuclear option is not really there, if they could make his nuclear football play the Stars and Stripes, they wouldn't need to send any other message, really. That would be enough for him to know that his nuclear command and control was profoundly infiltrated, useless, and broken. So that would be, and I guess you need perhaps one other point for the cyber intervention, but it doesn't have to be a whole context. But Brandon, Jay, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we have in cyber is we're not really looking at it from the spectrum of signals. And in IR, we have this thing about cheap and costly signals. And I think what's going on in cyber is these are very weak signals. These are signals that are not really achieving the desired effect, and that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing a lot of tests of the idea, tests of a proof of concept, and they're not achieving the end goals. And that's really clear from the case, as Jay was saying, in Estonia, that it did not change behavior. The signal did not work, and we'll see how that develops in the future. But I think this is where we need more theory and more research to develop on these ideas of just what does cyber mean. And I'm sorry to keep saying cyber, but you know, I do agree with you that it's part of the spectrum. But you know, in some ways we can look at it as islands of theory, that we need to look at cyber, we need to look at drones, we need to look at AI, we need to look at all these future technological spectrum activities and look at them and integrate a part at some point. But I think we do need a lot more research on things like cyber signaling, as Martin's saying.
Final point from you, Jay?
Yeah, it's certainly interesting, Martin, and I want to talk to you about it because I suspect you have a good answer yourself. And a lot of it, especially when you think of the United States, you know, when we're thinking of a capability, you know, we're thinking about, oh, we've got this specific set of cyber capabilities, you know, the specific exploit, the specific vulnerabilities, and we want this to achieve this specific effect, and we've got, you know, entire chain of command and control that we have to go through that before that we can execute this this capability for a specific effect in line with national command and control. And it's very dedicated. We use it almost like any other kind of weapon or intelligence capability. And I think a lot of us are locked in that. And certainly, Martin, when I've thought about signaling or trying to use cyber in a coercive way, you say, well, if you want to coerce with a cyber tool, you've got to let the other side know what it is that you want them to do or to stop doing, and they have to have some sense of who their tormentor is and what they want. And it leads to, you know, in this sense of using cyber capabilities, it becomes very clear in how it might be used in that coercive and what kind of message needs to be brought across. What we've been talking about here isn't this kind of American military way of trying to use a cyber capability. It might be more of a significantly less clear and saying, all right, we just want to mix things up in the other country. We want to increase the friction. We want to decrease the trust. And in that sense, this clarity about the coercion, the clarity about the message, the clarity of what it is that we're trying to get done with this. It might not matter that it's a cheap signal in this sense, because it's just meant to muddy the waters and muck up the works. And that's difficult for us, certainly on the American military side, to think about that because we operate so very differently.
Well, thanks very much. We're almost out of time, and I'm going to have difficulty in summarizing the vast landscape that we've traversed in the course of the last 90 minutes. If you need, but I'll try in a moment, but if you need copies of the presentations, I guess you can just email or DM on Twitter Jay or Brandon. They will send you their slides, and Kieran, I think your remarks are going to be published in some other form. Is that right?
Eventually.
Eventually, yes. So just follow Kieran, and you'll get that too. And I suppose my fundamental takeaway from this is that it's not so different from looking at the other problems we have with defending our networks and computers. The substitute for the dread phrase cyber, I think it's just to say networks and computers, which is that there's always a perpetrator and there's always a victim. It doesn't matter whether the perpetrator is a hostile nation state trying to affect a government decision making, or whether it's a prankster trying to make what he thinks is a joke, or whether it's hooligans and political activists trying to disrupt things for their own ends, whether it's espionage or whatever. There's always someone trying to do something, and they're trying to do it to a person or to a institution with some aim in mind. And what happens in between, in a way, is detail. That's secondary. And I think so long as we keep on focusing on the perpetrator and the victim, and the adversary and the target, then we can keep our minds clear. So on that note, I promised to give Lauri about a minute at the end because he wants to say something. So before he says something, please join me in thanking our panelists for their excellent contributions. Jay, Brandon, Keir, thanks very much.
There is really one thing I'd like to say, and actually it's about the numbers. And Brandon referred to number 16 coercive cyber attacks they have found so far. And of course, it makes a problem for you because there is not too many cases to study and to research. And that was also the point made by Jay. But I think that if you compare this with the technical attacks, with thefts, billions or millions events, cyber events, which are going on every day, I think that actually justifies the reason why we had this panel here. We still have time to study, to discuss, and to prepare. And this is, I think, the most important conclusion, at least for me, from this session. Thank you very much, and let me give you over these small boxes on behalf of NATO CCD, CIE, and we will start again at 11 o'clock sharp.